Heavenly Father, we thank you so much, Lord, for this incredible day, for this opportunity to be together at your appointed time, at your sacred moed. Father, we thank you so much because you're so gracious to us. And in the times of our ignorance, you wink. May we have that grace and that compassion towards our fellow brethren as well, and lovingly extend to them a hand of friendship, of fellowship. Those who may be in the church as well as those who are out of your church. May we be a light to shine unto them, because we know the time is at hand, the time of your great work. And Father, we want to be of those who are able to stand in that day. We thank you for hearing us, and now we ask for your Holy Spirit to be with us in our hearts, in our minds, to give us clarity that we may both hear your voice and also obey it. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. I see two people that have heard this before from me. But I received a book from Janet. I don't see Janet here. Okay. So I know that some of the things I will be presenting today, many of you are already familiar with. I'm just a baby, and I'm learning, hopefully daily. So if what I'm presenting was a revelation to me, but not to you, then take comfort in knowing that review is always a good thing. So what we're going to do today is just review some things. And they're things that I think the majority of you are very familiar with. And if you're not familiar with it, then I hope that it's of interest to you. I would like to preface everything by saying I'm not an expert in prophecy. In particular, Daniel, I don't pretend to have all the answers. I'm simply going to present something that I heard at one point in time, and I found it to be both inspirational and valuable because it awakened in my mind even more, a greater intensity. I saw the connection between Daniel and Revelation even better than I did before, and that was very exciting to me. So this is not a comprehensive study. We're going to skip over a lot of things. I'm just going to say this is how it is. And I think most of you are going to nod in agreement. We all, I think, understand where these concepts come from and how, for instance, a day for a year, how that has come to be our understanding. So, with that, the topic for today is Daniel 12. However, we're probably only going to spend about 5 to 10 minutes on that. And the rest of the time, we're going to be spending on other parts of Daniel and Revelation, because it's important for the second part of this subject matter to have, well, really, it's important for this subject matter as well. When we get to the punchline, to know exactly, have it fresh in our minds and know exactly how it is that this prophetic structure, how the prophetic structure is made. So, to begin with, I would like to do something fairly simple, and that is, let's read Daniel 12. Let's do the whole chapter. It will take us about 2 minutes. I'll get started reading while the rest of you finish finding it. Verse 1 says, "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars, forever and ever. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river, and the other on that side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, How long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,330 and 35 days. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest, and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. So briefly, when is the sealing of this book to take place unsealing of this book to take place according to what we just read? At the time of the end, we saw it twice, not only in verse 4, but also again in verse 9. So it is not then incomprehensible to this group, at least, I hope, that these things were not completely unsealed as of 1844. Perhaps that isn't so clear. The context here is the literal time of the end, the time in which we proclaim to be living in. Yet the majority of the Seventh-day Adventist church at large says these things have been fulfilled in the past. We're going to have a look at this today. Let's read this quote from Sister White, and I'm going to have a number of quotes today. I hope we can read them all. I may end up skipping a few of them. This is from Manuscript Releases, 21st volume. It says, "The time has come for Daniel to stand in his lot. The time has come for the light given him to go to the world as never before. If those for whom the Lord has done so much will walk in the light, their knowledge of Christ and the prophecies relating to him will be greatly increased as they near the close of this earth's history." Now, the interpretation of Daniel 12 by the early Adventists, and when I say early Adventists from this point forward, please understand that I mean those who came from the Millerite movement. I may even be referring to the Millerite movement itself. That's where our roots are. So the understanding of Daniel 12, according to the early Adventists, which came out of the various denominations, was that these prophetic periods were fulfilled as of 1844. And why is that? Because they believed Christ would come in 1844. Thus, any prophetic time period must have been fulfilled by 1844. Now, they correctly understood the prophecy of 1260 days from Daniel 7:25. Let's go ahead and read that together. Daniel 7:25. And he spake great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. Does that sound familiar? We just read that a little bit ago, didn't we? In Daniel chapter 12. Very similar language. We're going to come back to that in a little bit and address that similarity. But these early Adventists understood this time period correctly, in that time equal to year, times equals 2 years, dividing of time, half a year. We're reviewing 3.5 years total. Now, as we're all very likely very familiar with the prophecies of Daniel 7, we can think in our mind and evaluate. Daniel 7 is a prophecy that utilizes symbolic language. We see beasts coming up out of the sea. We see a great and terrible beast that has a little horn that comes out and uproots 3 horns from the roots. Uproots. So this isn't a literal horn that comes out of a terrifying creature. This is symbolic language. So likewise, we can understand that the time that is indicated to us in Daniel chapter 7 must also have a symbolic representation. So it's not our point or purpose here today to establish all of these things according to biblical references. I think most of us are familiar with that. But the times, and dividing of times, they understood to be 3.5 years in literal time, but it wasn't literal time, it was prophetic time. Thus, a day for a year turned this time period into 1260 years. Now, when they evaluated history, they saw, as did many of the reformers, that this was very specifically fulfilled in the history of the papacy. They saw that in 538 AD, from 1798, it filled this time period of 1260, when in 538 General Belisarius defeated the last of the 3 Aryan tribes, the 3 horns, and opened up the path for unrestricted political rule by the papacy. What were those 3 tribes? Yes, and the last ones defeated were the Ostrogoths. So now the papacy had nearly limitless power over the then known world, really, to put it bluntly, but all of Europe, most of the Middle East, and Northern Africa. Prior to this, the Pope was the Bishop of Rome. He was the head of a religious group. But now, he was something much more. He had political power. And this power continued for the 1260 years until February 11th of 1798. And we all know these dates. Napoleon's army came and took the Pope back to France, where he died in prison. This was the Great Wound. Now, we've done all this review so that we can refresh in our minds and be very well convinced that yes, the early Adventists did have a very good and profound understanding of the prophetic time periods, and they understood this time period correctly. Now, we won't necessarily go to this level of detail moving onward. So let's return back. We're going to jump forward, backward, so on and so forth between Daniel 12 and Daniel 7 and Revelation and back to Daniel. So right now we're going to jump back to Daniel 12. And we're going to see that Daniel 12 is actually the conclusion of a prophecy which commences in Daniel chapter 10. And from Daniel chapter 10 it goes through 11 and finally concludes in 12. There is no break in that prophetic revelation that Daniel received. as we look at Daniel chapter 10, we could see that this prophecy is different from the prophecies that Daniel received in chapters 7 and 8. This prophecy does not utilize symbolic language. So here the angel simply says that there will be 3 more kings, and then there will be a 4th. And that a great king will arise then from Greece, but his kingdom will be taken away and given to the 4 that would come after him who were not his descendants, and divided to the cardinal points of the earth. If we were to continue reading, well, we would see that this type of language continues through these chapters, and it's literal in nature. And as you look through history, you can see the literal fulfillment of the very things the angel was describing to Daniel. Thus, when you get to chapter 12, the prophetic time periods described, maybe it should be asked as a question. Would it be logical? Would there be any reason, according to the God of reason, to suddenly take a literal prophetic time or prophecy and suddenly apply prophetic time to it? Well, the early Adventist movement, composed of the Millerites, which had come out of the various Protestant denominations, proclaimed that Christ's return was to take place in 1844. This was based on the prophecy of the 2300 days of Daniel 8:14, which that we could read together. That's just one verse. We can afford that small. 8:14, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So the 2,300 days, again, were correctly understood by these early Adventists in symbolic or prophetic time, as extending from the 3rd decree to rebuild Jerusalem, given by King Artaxerxes in the year 457 BC. Thank you. 7th year?
Of his reign, in the 7th chapter of Ezra, beginning in the 7th verse.
Wow. I did not know that. That's fascinating. For those that did not hear, it's the 7th year of his reign in the 7th chapter of Ezra, beginning in the 7th verse. Very interesting. Thank you, Gary. However, in their interpretation of Daniel 8:14, the early Adventists followed the popular understanding of what the sanctuary was. Do we all remember what that interpretation was? The earth. So they understood that Christ was returned to the earth to purify all things. And this was the premise under which they established the date for Christ's return. Now, before I go any further, please understand, the Millerite movement was a movement directed by the Lord with great power. And they went through, and the movement that came about because of the message that was being given, it was evident that God's hand was directing this. I'm in no way detracting from the power of that movement. They saw how they had been providentially led in their understanding of Scripture, and they proceeded onward and forward. All historic applications of prophecy were found to have been fulfilled to the very letter in their studies as they went through history, including the death of Christ in the 70-week prophecy of Daniel 9:24 through 27. They understood then that Christ's return would be during the time frame of 1843, initially. I'm not the expert here. Brother Ben here already presented something on this subject that far went beyond anything that I have studied so far. But my understanding is that they first understood 1843 to be the date. So, when the day came and passed and Christ did not return, the question arose, where did we fail? What went wrong? They knew the Scripture wasn't wrong. God's Word is sure and true. So in their searching for the error which they perceived must have been in them. They found that the sanctuary which was to be cleansed was not the earth, nor was it the church, but rather it was the sanctuary in heaven. Now, why is this all this history of the early Advent movement so important to this particular subject? Well, once again, I've already stated it, because at that time they believed, under their revised understanding of the 2300 days, they believed the world would end in 1844. Thus, by necessity, all the prophetic periods must also end in 1844. They could not extend past. So, as a result, when they came to Daniel 12, they applied the same day-year prophetic principle, and the times, and a half, being the 1260 that we already read about in Daniel 12, I believe it was 7. I think it was 12:7. Yes. The times, and a half were interpreted as simply being a repetition of what they had already come to understand from Daniel 7:25, a confirmation. God does repeat himself, undoubtedly. The 1290 days then were placed as commencing 30 years prior to the 1260 days, or commencing in 508 AD. Now, when they looked historically, what they found was that in 507, there was a key incident. And by some means of which I'm not completely familiar with, they were able to rationalize or extend that period into 508. But in 508, there was a critical alliance that was made that was necessary for the papacy's political ascendancy. This alliance was with the previously non-Catholic king of the Franks, Clovis I. And Clovis, through the influence of his wife, was converted to Catholicism after a great victory that he had, and he then coercively convinced his armies to also convert. Well, with this alliance, now the papacy had all the military muscle it needed in order to do what its plan was, which was to destroy these three nations. Well, finish the destruction of these three nations that were a little pebble in their sandal, so to speak. So it seemed to the early Adventists, after seeing these events from prior to 538 and 508 as they understood it, that they were on the right track. The 1260 of Daniel 12 made sense. Now the 1290 made sense. So then they applied the same methodology to the 1335 of Daniel 12:12. Yes, 12:12. And what they came to was that 1335 is 45 more days than the 1290. So this pointed to a fulfillment, assuming the same starting date of 508 and extending out to 45 days further than the 1290. This gave them a fulfillment date of 1843. Now they had confirmation of what they had understood from the 2300 days. And it gave them, perhaps you could say it inspired them with faith, with confidence, that they were on the right track once again. However, the day of Christ's expected return came and passed in 1843. And of course, Christ did not return. They then understood, as I understand it, about the change in the eras. Yes. So what they had initially done was a mathematical calculation as it shows on the top row there, mathematically speaking, from -1 to +1 is how many integers? It's 2. But chronologically speaking, what is it from -1 to +1? Only 1. There's no such thing as year 0 BC or 0 AD. So the dates for Christ's return was then adjusted to be on the Day of Atonement, enter Samuel Snow. Thank you, brother. But the interpretation of the prophecies of Daniel 12 were not revised. They were not revisited. This was all based off of 2,300 days. 509, they would have needed to have done, correct. But they did not do so because maybe they were just focused on those 2,300 days. You know, it must have been a very interesting time to have been living in. I often imagine, or I wonder to myself, where would I have stood at that time when so many left the fold and only a few stayed to receive additional light? Well, regardless, 1335 was still considered to be fulfilled in 1843, despite now no corroborating evidence, you could say, but maybe a different word would be appropriate. No supporting prophecies to show that to be the case. Even today, I would say the official stance, but it's probably more non-official. The non-official stance of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is that the 1335 was fulfilled in 1843. And some, I don't say that all, but some are able to rationalize this by saying that on December 31st, 1843, at sunset, then you move into 1844, and therefore you can come into the 1844. And they elongate the time period that way, but I don't believe that that has merit for a number of reasons that we'll touch on later, but I don't think it's appropriate to elongate the time from 1843 to 1844. One of the things that we could mention is by doing so, they ignore the fact that the Day of Atonement is recognized as the end of the civil year in the Jewish calendar. Thus, to extend past that would be to impose a modern calendar construct on this ancient calendar, which was the basis for all their calculations. So anyways, 1335 takes us to the year 1843, not to 1844. And this is acknowledged by the world church today in general. But what does the prophecy say? The prophecy said, "Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,335 days, and not he that endureth past the 1,335 days." Now, if you have an SDA study Bible, does anybody have a study Bible here? We did this with the group here. They have a study Bible that has Ellen White quotes in it, charts and figures, and it has interpretations of Daniel in the appendices. And it was fascinating to see that in those Bibles, these are official publications from our print houses, they spend 2, maybe 3 pages explaining the prophecy of Daniel 2. They spend another 3, 4, 5 pages explaining the next series of prophecies, and they go through all the beasts of Daniel 7. Then they go through the goats, and they have images and pictures, and you're going page after page after page going through these explanations. And then it abruptly and summarily stops prior to Daniel 12. What I found online was this chart. I can't tell you where I first saw this. I thought it came from an Amazing Facts, but I don't know what the origin of this is. But this is one that we have had for I don't know how many years, Marlene. At least 20 years. But in this chart, which I believe to be a fairly well-used Adventist prophecy chart, you can see here towards the end, in this area here, my next slide will blow that up, I believe. They understood 538 AD, 1798, and 1844, these three key dates. Now, if you look down here to the bottom, you see the reference to 508 AD. Clovis defeats the Visigoths, and the 1335 days of Daniel 12. And this chart, which is, as far as I'm aware, an official chart from at least one, if not many other ministries, indicates to us 1843. Millerites waiting for second coming. Does that sound like a satisfactory interpretation for a verse, Daniel 12:12, that says, "Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1335 days"? That isn't a blessing.
As you mentioned earlier, that got on the screen, the defeat of the Visigoths was actually in 507, and pushed them past the southern French border into Spain. And they signed a treaty and acknowledged in the next year.
That's how they pushed it forward with the treaty. Okay. I didn't realize that portion of the... Well, I don't know how to get out of this pointer, but we'll just leave it like that for now. So one more point regarding the prophetic periods. The early Adventists also understood that the trumpets had been fulfilled in the past. This was again a product of the belief that 1844 was the end date. Beyond that point forward, nothing else could occur. This was not necessarily a misunderstanding, because we do have inspired information telling us that the trumpets did have a fulfillment prior to 1844. But it doesn't say that that was the only fulfillment. And in fact, notice this quote. "Solemn events before us are yet to transpire. Trumpet after trumpet is to be sounded, vial after vial poured out, one after another upon the inhabitants of the earth." So here, Mrs. White clearly indicates that there is a future fulfillment to the trumpets, just as the vials, which is a reference to the plagues being poured out, have a future fulfillment. Thus, since the founding of the movement, all prophetic events, with the exception of the 7 last plagues, were defined as having been fulfilled in history, and this understanding generally has persisted in the mainstream until the very present day. However, not only does Ellen White state that the trumpets are in the future, but she also states that the prophetic periods in the book of Daniel are yet to have their fulfillment in the last days. Notice a representative quote here. "In the Scriptures are presented truths that relate especially to our own time, to the period just before to the appearing of the Son of Man, the prophecies of Scripture point. And here their warnings and threatenings preeminently apply. The prophetic periods of Daniel, extending to the very eve of the great consummation, throw a flood of light upon events then to transpire. None need remain in ignorance. None need be unprepared for the coming day of God." We're going to come back to this quote later. This is such an important quote to understand. Let's look at another one. "The light that Daniel received direct from God was given especially for these last days. The visions he saw by the banks of the Ulai and the Hiddekel, the great rivers of Shinar, are now in process of fulfillment, and all the events foretold will soon have come to pass." 15th volume of manuscript releases. Let us read and study the 12th chapter of Daniel. It is a warning that we shall all need to understand before the time of the end. We already read this one, but we'll read it again. Daniel shall stand in his lot at the end of the days. John sees the little book unsealed. Then Daniel's prophecies have their proper place where? In the first, second, and third angels' messages to be given to the world. The unsealing of the little book was the message in relation to time. So we have very clear input, therefore, from the spirit of prophecy, letting us know that at least some, if not all, of the prophetic periods described in Daniel are yet to have a fulfillment prior to the end. So I promised you we were going to go back and forth, so we're going to switch gears again, and we're going to jump ahead now to Revelation chapter 13. I wanted to read it, but I think we all know it, and for the sake of time, perhaps we should just summarize it. In Daniel 13, we see the papacy receives a mortal wound. That wound is then healed. And all the world wonders after the beast, and they worship the dragon. And it was given to the beast to make war with them and to overcome them, and power was given him over all nations and kindreds and tongues and people. So now I ask, has the papacy received power over all nations, kindreds, and tongues? This has not happened. So this is an indication of something yet to be fulfilled. This is important to our study of Daniel chapter 12. So let's file that away for now. Now we know that the papacy has received some authority, and I'm trying to summarize here my notes. In 1929, Mussolini and Pope Pius the 11th signed the Lateran Treaty, whereby the papacy received the Vatican as sovereign land. They have their own currency, they have their own everything. The Pope is now, since then, a head of state, and he has all of the privileges that go together with being a head of state. He does not need a visa to come to the U.S., nor to Brazil, nor to England, nor anywhere else. Once the papacy receives authority then over all nations, verse 8 tells us in Revelation 13 that all that dwell upon the earth will worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb. So this worship we understand as obedience to man-made laws which are in contradiction. All man-made laws, possibly could be said, are in contradiction to God's commandments. And we can thus understand that the exchange of God's Sabbath and his feast days for Sunday and the holy days, as well as acceptance of a false Trinity God in place of the one true God and Father of all, will constitute the great part of this test. But we also know from inspired writing that the great challenge or the great test will be the seventh-day Sabbath. Now those who refuse to honor the papal falsehoods will be the ones which verse 7 tells us that the beast will make war against and overcome. We're going through all this stuff for a reason, because I believe it's reflected in Daniel chapter 12, as we'll see in a little bit. The second part of Revelation chapter 13 describes a second beast, who is United States, of course. This beast is prophesied to form an image unto the first beast. What do we understand that image to be?
Apostate Protestantism is an American papacy, essentially.
Correct, an American papacy, which would be the union of church and state, and the subsequent then enforcement of a false day of worship. So, once this state-mandated observance of a false day of rest has been put into force in the United States, the rest of the world will then follow suit. How do we know this? I got a bunch of quotes here. We're only going to look at 3. I'm going to skip the last 2 for the sake of time. Well, actually, we're doing pretty good. We'll just read them. As America, the land of religious liberty, shall unite with the papacy, enforcing the conscience and compelling men to honor the false Sabbath, the people of every country on the globe will be led to follow her example. The Sabbath question is to be the issue in the great final conflict in which all the world will act a part. Now, I think those of us who understand the depth and breadth of the Sabbath can see that this is also referring us to something more than just the seventh-day Sabbath, quite possibly. Foreign nations will follow the example of the United States. Though she leads out, yet the same crisis will come upon our people in all parts of the world. This is fairly definitive. It's from the testimonies for the church. It very clearly is telling us here that the United States will be the first to implement this law. Many of us, myself included, spend time looking at what are the events worldwide that are coming to pass. And we see Poland establishing laws, and we see Russia flexing its muscle, its religious muscle, and so on and so forth. But brothers, we know it's going to be here in the U.S. first, at least in the enforcement of a day of rest. The substitution of the false for the true is the last act in the drama. When this substitution becomes universal, God will reveal himself. When the laws of men are exalted above the laws of God, when the powers of this earth try to force men to keep the first day of the week, we know that the time has come for God to work. That's from the SDA Bible Commentary. The substitution of the laws of men for the law of God, the exaltation by merely human authority of Sunday in place of the Bible Sabbath, is the last act in the drama. When this substitution becomes universal, God will reveal himself. He will arise in his majesty to shake terribly the earth. From Testimonies to the Church. All right. So from Revelation, from inspiration, from the pen of inspiration, we understand and we comprehend that there will be laws that are enforced. Here in the U.S. first, followed by laws enforced worldwide, which will coerce mankind to keep a false day of worship, or false days, perhaps you could say, of worship. This is important because now we're going to come to the conclusion of the matter of this first session that we have together. We'll continue this next time, just for a quick preview, to see some what I found to be interesting practical applications to our lives of how these prophecies affect us, more so than just the events to take place. So back to Daniel 12 in the conclusion. I'm going to offer to you a suggestion for an alternate understanding of the time periods of Daniel chapter 12. I know that these are possibly a dime a dozen out there. But when I heard this one, it resonated with me because it repeated what we just went through from the book of Revelation, but in more specificity. And so, let's read Daniel 12:11 together. Daniel 12:11. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. I think we all know the word sacrifice was supplied. Sister White saw, or she was shown, that that word was not to be included in the text. So, the context of the question being asked, which this is the answer to the question being asked by Daniel. He didn't understand. He heard the explanation, the or the time times and a half. And he said, I don't understand, Lord. What are you talking about? And Christ tells him this response that we just read regarding the 1,290 days. So this is in regard to the timing for the events that were previously described, which were events of the end. In this verse, there are a couple of what you might refer to as problematic phrases, confusing things. The first is the daily. And there are at least two predominant trains of thought regarding the daily. The first I already have projected on the screen. It's paganism, and this was the understanding of the early Adventists. Again, the Millerites is what we're talking about. This position was reinforced in Uriah Smith's book, Thoughts on Daniel and the Revelation, where he made this very clear. Now, there was some debate at the time. I'm no church historian, so I can't get into those details. Gary probably could, but I have the microphone right now, Gary. So we'll move on. Haskell also defined it in the same way in his book, which was the story of Daniel and the prophet. However, he provided what I think is a key additional element to help us get down a little bit closer to what does paganism mean, because the daily is confusing and paganism is maybe slightly less confusing, but yet I'm simple-minded. Help me, Lord. Well, before we get to what Haskell said, the second predominant interpretation of the daily today is Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. I haven't finished reading the book you gave me. I got through a little bit of it, Janet, and I think this is what the writer was emphasizing, but I can't be certain. He uses very doctorly words that I had trouble getting through. Well, the second interpretation is perhaps what elicited, or a part of what elicited from Ellen White I think the following statement. Yes. I don't have it in my notes, so I will read it from here. Then I saw, in relation to the daily, referring to Daniel 8:12, that the Lord gave the correct view of it to those who gave the judgment hour cry. What was the view that they had? Paganism. When union existed before 1844, nearly all were united on the correct view of the daily. But in the confusion since 1844, other views have been embraced, and darkness and confusion have followed. There's very little in the writings of Ellen White to clarify what the daily is, and this is probably the most pointed statement that she makes. Now, Ellen White did write very highly of Haskell, and she really declared him to be one of the greatest Bible students of her time. So maybe it's worth seeing what Haskell had to say about it. He says, paganism, the daily of Daniel 8:12, was taken away, it is true, and Rome became nominally a Christian empire. Her emperor professed the name of Christ and carried before his army the banner of the cross. To John, this transfer from paganism to the papacy is represented as a transfer of power from the dragon to the beast. So, paganism is really just a part of that definition. The definition could be expanded according to Haskell, what Haskell wrote, and what I believe Ellen White endorsed in her endorsement of Haskell, as a transfer of power. Let's keep that in mind. The next challenging phrase that we find is the abomination that makes desolate. We don't have time to really break this apart. So we'll just dive right in and say that this is simply the papacy, or more specifically, the joining of church and state. The abomination that makes desolate. It is abomination before God when those who profess to be His followers take on political rule for their own gain. So the joining of church and state is the abomination that makes desolate, but specifically followed by enforcement of man-made laws in place of God's laws. Maybe you could say the enforcement of a Sunday law. Now combine these two understandings, the daily being the power to rule, abomination that makes desolate being enforcement of a Sunday law, and you read Daniel 12:11 as follows. From the time that the power to rule of the nations is taken away and the joining of church and state is set up, thereby establishing a national Sunday law, there shall be 1,290 days. Thus, the 1,290 days, I'm going to suggest to you, commence at the establishing of a national Sunday law in the United States, which we've already seen from the prior quotes in Last Day Events that precedes anything happening worldwide. The 1,260 days then follows 30 days, or commences, I should say, 30 days after the commencement of the 1,290 days. And these 1,260 days are initiated by the worldwide Sunday law. Thus, the two periods of the 1,260 and the 1,290 terminate at the same date, but the 1,290 start 30 days prior. Is that clear? Okay. So now at this point, it's worth repeating a portion of one of the quotes that we read before. I think I got it in here. No. Here it is. The prophetic periods of Daniel, extending to the very eve of the great consummation, throw a flood of light upon events then to transpire. Let's go back to this again. Let's move on. The 1,335 days, this time frame commences at the same time as the 1,290 days, but then extends 45 days beyond the termination of the 1,290 days. So this time of 45 days is the period where there will be a death decree. This is the time of Jacob's trouble. The time preceding it, the 1,260 days, would be the time of trouble where all earthly support will be cut off. So while this is a time of great anguish for God's people, our Father will protect His children, because at the time of the 45 days beyond the 1,290, there would be no benefit to the heavenly kingdom by the death of a single martyr in the name of Christ. All cases have been decided. So therefore, not a single righteous soul will suffer the death of a martyr. God shields them from the final assault of the enemy. Michael stands up in their defense. We already read that. So there's still some more left to be identified. TBD usually means to be determined. In this case, it means to be discussed. We'll get to that next time. So come back next time. So what did we read in that quote? The prophetic periods of Daniel extend to the very eve of the great consummation. What's the very eve of the great consummation? Thank you. That's all it is. This is the very eve prior to the salvation of God's people, to their deliverance, I should say, of God's people, and the appearance of our Lord Jesus Christ in the clouds of heaven. So assuming that the suggested sequence of events we've just laid out is correct, which is it is an assumption, you will have to judge for yourself whether it's a good assumption or not. Assuming that it's correct, it's truly an incredible thing to behold this quote and to consider what it is that she was telling us was to occur. All right, I'm going to leave you with one final thought regarding Daniel 12. This was such a revelation to me, and I know that almost all of you are going to know this already. And maybe one or two don't know, so then I'm holding on for that. All right. We previously read in Daniel 7:25 that regarding the period of time, times, and dividing of time, and we saw a very similarly worded prophetic time period in Daniel 12:7 that says time, times, and a half. So there's a lot of similarity in the English language, but interestingly, the similarity ends there. The word time and times in Daniel 7:25 is Strong's H5732, Idan. It's actually Aramaic, even though it says H. They don't have an A5732, do they? So the definition, according to Strong's, is a set time, but specifically referring to a year or a time frame. The word time, times, in Daniel 7:12 is a different word, because unlike chapter 7, which was written in Aramaic, chapter 12 was written in Hebrew. And the word that Daniel, a scholar, a Hebrew, chose to describe times, times and a half in 7:25 was H4150, Moed. Thus, what I understand, my personal interpretation, this is about the only original thought in this whole presentation, but then I saw Janet's book and it wasn't original to me anyways. Anyway, what I understand is the direct implication of this is that the time frame for commencement, duration, and termination of these prophetic periods are to be regulated and coordinated in accordance with Yahweh's holy feast days. This was so beautiful to me, I can't even begin to describe to you what I felt when I saw this for the first time. Because I have known in my heart, ever since coming to the understanding of God's appointed times, that you can see it in the type, in the typology. Everything is pointing to this plan of salvation, which takes you all the way through the 1,000 years in heaven. But I couldn't point to a verse. I couldn't find, I guess what you might call a proof text. This may not be considered a proof text, but even though I believed it in my heart, I couldn't find something that said, yes, here it is. You can have faith, Eric. But now I see that it's even more than what I thought before. I thought before that Christ would return at tabernacles. This is the typology that we see in tabernacles. Now I see that according to Christ's description in Daniel 12, all the events are regulated by his holy times. While these final fearful events are not something I think anyone is looking forward to, doesn't it bring a smile to your face to know that all is in God's hands and He has it planned out according to His set times? The Father has foreordained these events to occur in coordination with His times, that we are here right now seeking to honor and obey. So take courage, my brothers and sisters. Stay on that narrow path. Despite what everybody seems to be telling you, stay on this path. All things are under His control, and we have His sure promises, on which rest our hopes. So in our next session, we will discuss additional applications of what we just identified, and we're going to fill in those question mark boxes on that chart. So it's my hope that this has been a blessing to you. If there's something that you can take from this, perhaps not all of this was new, perhaps some of it was new, none of it may have been new, but I believe that there is an important message for us yet, even now, as a people to comprehend from Daniel 12. So may God bless us all as we continue to study in His Word. May He lead and guide our minds always.